Good morning and welcome to the University of California Cooperative Extension Master Gardeners Garden in Place Workshop. The date today is July 7, 2020, and today we're going to spend some time talking about saving seeds and squash and common misconceptions that people have had when they come into a gardening space. So it should be an interesting morning. First up this morning, though, we have Master Gardener Jessica Yarger, who is going to talk to us about saving seeds, particularly squash seeds. So you don't have to go to the store and spend money on something you already have. Jessica?
Good morning. Thank you, Roger. I'm going to share my screen. So today I'll be talking about squash and saving seeds, and specifically about squash. The seed saving process does differ from different types of plants. So just keep that in mind, that today is really specific to squash. And it's something that a lot of gardeners grow in their gardens. And seed saving is a fun thing to try out, to do. It might save you a little bit of money. Some people like to save seeds from varieties that are a little bit more rare. I had seeds one year, this was several years ago, from Seed Savers Exchange that they only offered up once, and I saved seeds, and for years afterward I had people contacting me through a blog I kept at the time asking for those seeds. So I'm going to just start at the beginning, and saving seeds starts with the seed that you choose to plant. So it really does take planning right from the beginning. So we typically, in our home gardens, are planting either hybrid or open pollinated seeds. Hybrid seeds are seeds that have been crossbred for certain traits, and they cannot be used for seed saving. They produce a seed that's what we say is unstable. So you don't know what you'll get when you save seeds from hybrids. It will revert, or it could revert back to one of its parent plants. And when you purchase seeds in the store, if they are hybrids, they are clearly marked as a hybrid or F1. It's a legal thing that the seed companies do need to let us know when we're buying a hybrid. So when planting squash or any plant for seed saving, you do need to start with an open pollinated seed. And that's a seed that when pollinated by the right variety, the same variety of the species, will give you what's called a true seed. So you can be sure that when you harvest that seed and plant it again, you're going to get the same tomato, squash that you started with. And then often you'll see heirloom seeds on the label as well. And an heirloom seed is the open pollinated seed. The difference is that we know the story or the lineage of that specific variety. Usually it's connected to a family or a Native American tribe or peoples from other parts of the world, but there's like a documented lineage there, and that's what heirloom means. So before we get started with the seed saving part, just a quick recap of some botany, some plant biology, and parts, because it's important for seed saving. So I just have a simple diagram of a flower. This particular flower has both male and female parts. The parts that we're really need to focus on are the stamens, so the filament and anther. That is the male part of the plant. And the stigma here, let's see, let me get my pointer. Here at the top, this is the female part of the plant. When we are thinking about pollination, the filament or the stamens, okay, here, the anther is where the pollen from the plant is that will then be transferred, okay, to the stigma for pollination. So that is the process. So the pollen from the anther will land on the stigma in various ways. Sometimes it's insects, sometimes it's wind. So various ways. Sometimes it's just happens inside of itself, especially in a flower with both parts. And once the pollen lands here on the stigma, Okay, it sends tubes down here to the ovary, okay, where this is where the seeds will be too, which often in cases such as squash will swell and become the fruit that we eat. So this is a diagram of a flower that has both parts, but a squash flower produces two different kinds of flowers. On the left-hand side, we have a female flower, and you can see that the flower is attached to the ovule or ovary. The ovules are inside, so that will become seeds. And inside this flower, which I could not find a picture of an open female flower, is the stigma. It only has the female parts, but they're really easy to identify the female from the female or from the male because of the little fruit, the thing that's going to become the fruit that's attached to the flower. On the right-hand side is a male squash flower. My finger is pointing at the stem, and you can notice that there is no fruit here. There's no ovary here. It is just a stem. Inside the male flower are the stamen, where the pollen will be. So typically, when you're growing squash, the male flowers will appear first. You'll get some male flowers before you have any female flowers, and that's normal. So if you're growing and you're not seeing them right away, it's okay, they're coming. And then later on, you'll have both female and male flowers that will be opening at the same time on the plant. All right. So squash are insect pollinated. So this becomes important when thinking about pollination and seed saving. On this slide, on the left-hand side, in the bolded words, these are the 4 common species of squash that we grow in our home gardens. I, just for an example, went through and listed the kinds of squash that I have growing in my garden currently. So on the right-hand side, you're going to see the varieties within the species. So for example, in the Cucurbita maxima, I'm growing red curry squash, Cinderella carriage pumpkins, and Lakota squash. All of these varieties, those 3 I just listed, can cross-pollinate. So the carriage pumpkin male flowers can pollinate the red curry flowers, and I will get a successful fruit. However, the red curry cannot pollinate a black beauty zucchini, for example, because it does need to be within the same species. But this matters most now because if I want to make sure that when I pollinate a red curry squash and I'm saving those seeds, I want to make sure that those seeds that I harvest are red curry seeds and not red curry crossed with Cinderella pumpkins. Because I might get something different. I might get something really unusual that's really awesome, or I could get something that's just pretty mediocre and average. And if I'm saving and I'm passing my seeds around, I want to make sure that the seeds that I'm telling people they have are the seeds that they have. So in a garden with plants that are insect pollinated, it becomes tricky to save seeds and making sure that they're true to their parent plant. So squash blossoms, because they're insect pollinated, need to be isolated. Now, seed savers for commercial companies and in gardens have a few different ways that you can isolate blossoms from insects. One is timing, which doesn't work well for squash because mostly our squash are blooming all at the same time. They tend to bloom continuously because they are growing on a vine. So you'll have flowers that will bloom, die, and then there's new growth. And so it's not really possible to isolate your squash with time. The other way is distance, and a lot of commercial seed growers will definitely use distance, but for the home gardener, you need at least a minimum of a half mile distance between varieties of the same species. So I know in my own garden, just by what I guess I like to plant lots of different kinds, that's not possible, but I also have no control over what my neighbors are growing. So I could decide I'm just going to plant one variety, let's say the Black Beauty zucchini, but I don't know what my neighbor's growing or the person 3 blocks away from me is growing. So because the insects travel far, the spacing in a suburban or urban setting is also difficult to manage. So for isolating blossoms, we have to use a physical barrier. So one physical barrier is netting. However, then you must introduce pollinators into your netted setting. So an easy way for the home gardener is to use what you see here, picture clothespins, to keep the flowers shut and isolated until you're ready to pollinate. So in this photo, I have, these are female flowers, but you should also clip closed your male flowers. And you do this the night before you think they're about to open. Squash flowers open really, really early in the morning. And unless you can be up for the bees, before the bees or other pollinators, you have to be sure that you are making that isolation before they open, because you don't want any pollinator visiting your flowers before you have a chance to do the pollinating yourself. So pollination, so you would close up your flowers with a clothespin, or they're already going to be closed, so just kind of keep them pinned the night before or the afternoon before. And then the next morning, still going out pretty early because pollinating is done best early in the morning, you can hand pollinate. And we'll have a demo, like an actual demo on hand pollinating in the future, but I'll just quickly describe how that might go here. So I would remove the male flower that's pinned shut, and I just pick it, and then strip away all the petals, just exposing the stamen. Then I would move to my female flowers here, and I would remove the clothespin, but leave the flower intact. And then you just roll the stamen all over the stigma, spreading as much pollen as you can from the stamen to the female flower. Then I would reclose the flower and pin it shut with the clothespin. So this just ensures like maximum guard from any pollen from any other of your species, or I'm sorry, varieties of the same species getting pollen in there. And that's the reason for closing the male flower too, so that you don't have other pollinators visiting other flowers and possibly dropping pollen from another variety into the male flower as they're collecting nectar. So just the main thing is that making sure that the male flower is a match to the female flower from the same variety of plant. So for example, in my garden, I would make sure my red curry female flowers were pollinated with red curry male flowers. It does not need to be from the same plant, but it does need to be from the same variety. Otherwise, you'll get a cross pollination. And then it's really, really important to mark the fruit that you've hand pollinated for saving seeds. And there's a couple ways you can do it. One is to tie something loosely around the stem at the base of the fruit. So right kind of down in this area. I've seen that, like, I don't know if you've seen that green kind of stretchy plastic tape. It's not really tape, it's not sticky. People used to tie up tomatoes and other such things, and you can actually mark it with the variety and the date if you want. You can write on it to give you some information. And that's useful because if you have a plant, especially if you're doing pumpkins and you have different varieties growing all together, sometimes it's hard to sort out which vine is connected to which. However, when they ripen, you might have a better sense of which kind of squash, but you can just label with the variety. The other way people mark them is they scar the fruit. And you can do that by just pressing your nail into the young fruit that you see right there and making an X or some sort of mark that will scar. It won't hurt the fruit, it'll heal up pretty quick, and then you'll have like a little X. However, that doesn't allow you to write or document any other information, but either way will work. And that way you know that when you're going to save seeds, these are the fruits, these are the squash or zucchini or whatever it is that, that you hand pollinated, and you're relatively sure this is, you know, going to be the ones that have the true seeds, the true seed to the parent plant. And then lastly is knowing when to harvest and how to store the seeds. So we have both summer and winter squashes, and possibly gourds, because they of course fall into this category as well. Just an aside, cucurbita is Latin for gourd, so this is like our gourd family. So plant maturity. So for the summer squashes, we typically harvest like zucchinis and patty pans and those softer squashes we eat soft when they're very young. They're not mature and they don't have mature seeds. So if we're harvesting for seed saving from the summer squashes, we need to let those vegetables or those fruits stay on the plant for much longer and let them get way bigger than sort of like those runaway zucchini size that you see, the one that you've missed and it's now huge. You want to just let it sit on the plant for the majority of the season. It'll get tough, it'll get big, but you want to make sure that those seeds inside are getting mature. And you can let it sit until the plant dies back. And the same is true, of course, for winter squash, the pumpkins and butternuts and all of that, which we also do grow during the summer. We just harvest them in the fall, usually, or typically, and store them through the winter. So those you leave as you would grow a pumpkin or whatever on the vine. You can also let them hang on longer. You can also, once they're harvested, once your vines have died back or they're ready to harvest, is let the squash sit for another 2 to 3 weeks, because the seeds will continue to mature inside the pumpkin for those few weeks. And I mean, that's not a hard and fast, but you know, if you want to be extra sure, go ahead and let it sit. If you're curing your squash for storage, you do that anyway, so you can do that. You can then go ahead, and once your fruit is mature enough, you can cut them open like you would a pumpkin. They do suggest you do not cut right down the middle, because you could hurt seeds along the way from your hard squashes, but you know, cut along the top and then scoop them out like you would when you're carving a jack-o'-lantern and hollowing out the middle. Scoop out those seeds and put the seeds and pulp in a big bowl of water. This makes it much easier to separate the pulp from seed. The pulp will often kind of float up to the top, so you can even pour off the top water a little bit and refill until they get really clean. You may notice that some seeds will float up to the top. Sometimes that means, especially for the bigger seeds, that those are immature seeds, so you can pour those off and discard them in your compost or wherever you're putting your pulp. However, that's not true across the board. I just want to caution that some squash seeds are light and will float anyway. But if you're noticing that most of your seeds are sinking in the bowl and just a few are floating, I would say it's safe to discard those, as they may not be viable. Once you've gotten them well rinsed, you need to pat them dry with a cloth towel. Paper towels will stick. And then dry them in a single layer on a tray or a screen if you have one, for a couple of weeks in an airy, cool, shady kind of spot where the air can circulate. Don't lay them on paper towels, because the paper will stick to the seeds. So something that they will easily get removed from. And then make sure your seeds are completely dry before storing in a cool, dry place, because mold is that's going to get them. So make sure that they are completely dry. I store my seeds in paper envelopes. And then, of course, mark your seeds with what they are and the year that you harvested them. Um, and then if you want to, you can do like a germination test. So if you have tons of seeds, you can see what your germination rate might be. So you can either use put them in a moist paper towel for a few weeks, put them in a little tray, and take note of how many you've planted and how many germinated, and then you'll know your germination rate and see if you were successful in growing a mature seed. And that's it. That's the end of a quick how-to on how to save squash seeds. Again, because they're insect pollinated, there's these other steps that we have to take to isolate the blossoms from all those wonderful pollinators.
Very cool. We do have a couple of questions
Uh-huh.
that came up in the chat. The first one is, should I save seed from the first ripe best tomato or pepper, or will that lower overall plant production? Or is it better to wait till the end of productivity?
Um, I'm not sure about the tomatoes, but for squash, I've read that it's best to not save them from the first one, because especially for squash, that will lower your production. Because a plant's like number one job is to produce seeds. So once they think that, oh, I've done that, they'll slow down the seed production. It's also, I did not say this, but it's also good if you can harvest seeds for saving from multiple plants of the same variety. Because if you just just start saving seeds from one plant, over time, like that reduces the genetic pool diversity greatly. So if you have like 2 or 3 of the same variety growing in your garden, try to get seeds from plant. The more the better. If you have a friend that's growing the same variety, both of you do it and mix your seeds together, because the more plants you have that you're gathering seed from, the better long run the genetic pool, the gene pool is going to be maintained. Some types of crops really don't fare well over years of sort of what we call inbreeding, where it's the same plant. You want to kind of keep that genetic diversity as big as possible, the pool as big as possible.
Very cool. There is another question. It refers to end rot, and I'm going to ask one of the master gardeners that's sticking around to go find us the link to the UCANR webpage about end rot, and then we'll come back to that question and provide the link for that, because that's a very specific thing, and it's a cultivation thing primarily. So, but as far as the seed saving, you bring up a valid point. Is actually there are quite a few plants that if you want to keep them producing, you have to keep harvesting. Excuse me, because once they set seed, they're done. Excellent. Anastasia has found the end rot link. If you'd be willing to please chat that out on the public chat. End rot is a thing that has to do with how you are treating your plant, and you might check this link out to answer that question. Or you can Google end rot UCANR, and it will be right there. Excellent. All right. Any other quick questions about the seed saving type? Because we are going to lose Jessica any minute now. She has to run off to her next presentation. All right. Last call. All right. Well, if you think of something, feel free to put it in the chat. Jessica monitors the Ask an LA County Master Gardener Facebook page, as well as some others of us. So feel free to post those kind of questions there. We do want to, though, keep talking about some of the squash situation, some of the squash growing, zucchini, pumpkins, all those sorts of things. And one of the things that we want to talk about is how they get pollinated. Now, Jessica mentioned hand pollinating, because that's a thing that you can do to assure that you have basically an arranged marriage. You have a parent, and you know what you're going to get. If you have insect pollination, you may or may not get pollen from the exact same species of plant, or something that will be viable. So I want to very briefly have a little chat about some bees not all bees and not a great detail about bees, but bees particularly as they are related to pollination. The most effective bee to pollinate a squash plant is, shockingly, the squash bee. There you go. There's a link that we'll put up in a little bit in the chat that you can go to and read all about squash bees. They are squash specialists. They are yellow color that's similar to the color of an actual squash. They are known to sleep in the closed flowers. The males are even more yellow than the females and mostly come around in the mornings looking for mates. And as I say, they do sleep in the flowers. In fact, squash bees are unique in that they fly very early in the morning. You might remember Jessica said those blooms open early. Some varieties of squash bees actually have vision that allows them to see really well in the dark. And as a result, they're out at dawn looking for squash. Here's a squash bee. The females are slightly bigger than your average Western honeybee, and the males are slightly smaller than your average Western honeybee. And they're a lot more, I don't know, for lack of a better word, squashy looking. And they crawl right down in there and they get up after the pollen, and they do a very, very good job of pollinating squash. You'll notice that they're binomial. Their specific epithet, the scientific name, is Pepon apis. Pepon, like cucurbita pepo, meaning squash bee, and then in the particular kind of squash bee that it is. You can go on to a place like iNaturalist, however, and if you do that and you put in Pepon apis, you will find that in the red box area in Southern California, there have been all of 48 observations of these bees in the last 7 to 10 years. That's not a lot. They are not strictly speaking endangered, but they're not as common as they used to be. And these are essentially the best pollinator for your squash. So it might be that if you're not getting set on your squash, you may want to get in there and do a little hand pollinating, even if you don't clamp them shut to keep the bees away, just to make sure the job happens. You can get a paintbrush, get in there and stir it around in the male pollen, take it over and stir it around in the female flower, and just assure that that connection gets made. There are many varieties of Pepon apis. The one that's most common in California is the pruinosa, as you see there. There's also other bees that will pollinate squash, and one is the valley carpenter bee. It's a native, big old black thing, sometimes with a yellow back on it, sometimes not. And they're often regarded as evil by squash farmers, as it were, because they are also what we call nectar robbers. They much prefer to land on the outside of a flower, especially a small flower that they're too big for, and chew a hole in the flower and then suck the nectar out of the side of the flower. And on a squash, that can wreck it. But the squash flower is big enough that carpenter bees make a pretty decent pollinator for them. This fellow is just crawling out of a partially closed flower. I have a video of him. He actually crawls in and you can see the flower going bzz, 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 as he's buzzing around inside this closed flower, safe from predators, and shaking the inside of the flower. And in fact, a lot of squash are what we call buzz pollinated. The pollen doesn't come off easily just by brushing up against it. You have to actually shake it a little bit. And the bee gets in and runs its wings, and as a result, the pollen falls off and coats the bee, and the bee can make use of it. Tomatoes, interesting little secret, are also buzz pollinated. So if you have bumblebees, big black bumblebees or carpenter bees running around, and they're not robbing nectar, and because tomato flowers are quite wide open, they will help your tomato flowers tremendously. Okay. Carpenter bees. This particular carpenter bee, by the way, you'll notice in its binomial, its scientific name, Xylocopa, wood eater. Vari puncta. The puncta sounds a lot like puncture to me. I bet if you looked it up, that's basically what it would be. All right, so the wood eaters, the valley carpenter bees. Here's a fella that is also a California native bee, and this is not on a squash. This is a longhorn bee on a Coahuila sage, a Mexican native sage. And he's also a nectar robber, and he's here because regular honeybees and natives like this one do pollinate the squash, but this fella is a nectar robber specifically. If you look, you will notice that he's got some pincers right there, and he's just about to take a bite out of that flower. And the flower is twice as long as he is. His tongue is not that long. His proboscis will not get him down into the nectar. So he comes up to the side of this flower, makes a little hole, and then sucks the nectar out. But as a consequence, no pollen gets down in there. And the on many flowers, this damages the ovary sufficiently that they don't set fruit. So some people don't like the nectar robbers. Um, an interesting thing is honeybees, Western honeybees. They're not native, but they typically go in and they go through the front end of the front door of the flower. They're typically not nectar robbers. They lack the pincers to be a nectar robber that our local honeybees have. But they are anything but they are a little bit lazy. They're anything but stupid. They will find a flower that's already been bitten open, and they'll come drink there too. They'll take whatever the easiest route is to that particular flower. Now, this is kind of interesting to me because there was this pair of longhorn bees that they were settling down for the evening. It's about 6 o'clock at night yesterday, as a matter of fact, in our front yard. And these bees sleep on flowers. They're not hive bees, they're solitary. And this fellow looks like he is just a little bit annoyed at being photographed while he's trying to settle down for the night. Says, do you mind? I'm sleeping here, kind of a thing. But here's the creepy part. If you look at his eye, and I'll blow it up here for you, look really closely at his eye, and what do you see? Right here. Yes, you see some guy with a cell phone shoving it at the bee. That bee is looking right at me, and reproachfully at that. I tell you, it's haunting to me every time I see it. And right next to that guy with his cell phone is the house. The more you look at it, the more you can't unsee it. Sure, it's out of focus, but wow. So suddenly I'm looking over my shoulder, walking around out there because the bees, man, they're watching. They're watching. All right. So we wanted to touch base about our friends, the bees. There are lots of pollinators for squash. Bumblebees are really good, the classic California bumblebees. The native squash bees are really good. Carpenter bees will pollinate them, even though they're known as robber bees. And we have an awful lot of non-hiving native bees in addition to the standard honeybee that will get in and get after your squash. And part of the problem is the first three of these, the bumblebees, the squash bees, the carpenter bees, are particularly susceptible to problems with pesticides. So if you've sprayed for something and it gets all over the flowers, you're going to have problems with pollination. So the lower use of pesticide is really useful to make sure that you're actually getting pollinators to come in and do their job and not killing them off as well. So speaking of pollinators, well, real quick, any questions about squash bees? I think it's pretty straightforward. They even have the right name. I mean, you know, what's to guess about it? It's a squash bee. What is it like? Squash. Awesome. But we have some interesting squash, probably pollinated by a squash bee, if you really want to know. Master Gardener Joan Borgman has a funky one that she would like to share with us very briefly. Joan, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi. I'd like to show you what I grew in my garden. I have this one called Trompetta di Albenga, an Italian variety that is, they grow into different shapes, and I just happen to have my steel ruler. They grow very large. I had some seeds that I had planted of this variety that I had grown with nursery school children, and they loved it. And it has a lot of hiding squash in. I liken this plant to a big Saint Bernard puppy. It grows rampantly. And I have my seed package is kind of dilapidated and falling apart. So I had to do a little bit of research on it to show you what it was. And well, I will tell you as I'm getting that for you that it is an Italian variety, and I was very interested to find out that There was a little bit of a mention in Jessica's presentation, the difference between a winter squash and summer squash, and a very basic overall designation is that the summer squash, they have the winter squash have a harder coat than the summer squash do. And this one, it turns out, is a kind of in-between squash. This Trompetta de Albenga is, as you see from Renee's garden where I had originally gotten them, is a rambling growing plant like that. And try to show the next one. Thank you. Is this I got off of the website from Wikipedia, that it shows that it's a cross somewhere in between a winter squash and a summer squash that I harvest it young, and it's this lovely striated pattern, and it's delicious. Thank you. And this is what it looks like growing in my garden. Like a lot of other squash, the fruits hide underneath in the leaves. Next one, please. And you see that's how they grow, all kinds of curly shapes. Nursery school children just love them. And next, please, just a few pictures of how they're growing in my garden. That's probably the one I have right here. And I was very excited to hear Jessica's presentation, because I know that I've used up all of my seeds, and I'm going to leave a few on there. That's to show you how it just takes over there. In general, like I said, I've learned that this is a cross between, halfway between a winter squash and a summer squash, that I know I cook as anyone would I grate them and I use it raw. I cut it up and I saute them. I bake them. But you could leave them on the vine longer, and you a nice harder shell on it. And I read that it might be compared, if you do that, it would be compared to a watery butternut squash. So there are millions of squash varieties out there, and I did want to share with you my crazy squash that I have growing in my garden. Thank you.
That's awesome. I love the fact that it's a hybrid between a winter squash and a summer squash. So it's a sort of squishy winter squash, or if you let it grow to maturity, a really hard crusted summer squash. And this is the part I love about summer and winter squash. They all grow in the summertime, but summer squash you have to eat in the summertime. A winter squash can get a hard coat on it, and you can save it and keep from starving to death over the winter because it will store well. And that's why they have those hard coats on them, and that's why they're winter squash. I thought for sure for years that they grew in the winter, and it didn't work when I tried to plant them in the winter, and I found out why many, many years ago. Which, kind of brings us up to our next spot. Master gardeners are people that have been trained for weeks on how to look stuff up quickly, and then how to understand what we've looked up. It doesn't mean that we knew everything. We came into the program and just got certified. We had to learn a lot, mostly about where to look. Master Gardener Judy Gomez is a recent 2020 grad as a Master Gardener, and one of the things that she likes to share is some of the revelations she had going through the process of being certified as a University California Cooperative Extension Master Gardener. So once again, we'd like to have Judy Gomez with True Confessions of a New Master Gardener. Judy?
Thank you, Roger. This is my first presentation where I actually have my official Master Gardener tag and my official homemade Master Gardener earrings. And you can tell that Jessica, Roger, and Joan are experts. And I am here to tell you that I am not, but I am learning so much from them. Now I kind of understand why the guy behind me would always ask me what kind of corn I'm growing this year, because he wanted to match my corn so that we wouldn't cross-pollinate and mess up our corn. So I am learning constantly. So I am here to talk about more true confessions of a new Master Gardener. That's me. And if you were here on June 16th, I believe it was, that's when I did my first presentation, and I talked a little bit about honeydew and a little bit about how to look up bugs and where to find what they are, and talked a little bit about chill hours. And today I have 3 more things that I didn't know much about. So let's go. Whoops. And as Roger said, I'm in the class of 2020. We just graduated in May. We had 50 fantastic people in that class, and a lot of us are out there right away getting involved. So Roger hooked me into getting involved in these presentations. So my first true confession is, what's the scoop on coffee grounds? I had heard so much about coffee grounds, a lot of confusion. People were using them or not using them. And so I decided, well, let me see what really the scoop is. So my local Starbucks, you could go by, of course, not during COVID because they can't share them anymore, but I could go by and pick up all sorts of coffee grounds, which I did. I picked up all sorts of coffee grounds. These are still sitting under my back porch. And the sticker on this bag actually says, the grounds reduce landfill waste and support environmental health. Well, that's absolutely true. And it also says they can be added directly to your garden as a side dressing for nitrogen-loving plants, but test with a small amount first. So I said, okay, I'm still confused about this. So I looked some stuff up. There's lots of UC A&R, that's University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, lots of information on coffee grounds, all science-based, and that's what I wanted to present to you today. So coffee grounds are rich in nitrogen. In composting, even though they're brown, I'm not a coffee drinker, but I believe coffee grounds are brown. They're considered a green in composting. And we've done workshops on composting, and we'll do more. But you need browns and you need greens, and the greens are rich in nitrogen. And contrary to what I thought and other people thought, is that they are not acidic. Actually, the acid in the coffee is water soluble, and we drink that acid when we drink coffee, and the grounds, the spent grounds, are left over and not acidic. In fact, their pH is right about 6.9, and 7 is neutral. So the information that I got, if you look real close under that slide, information from UC A&R, San Bernardino, Placer, Contra Costa Glen, and Nevada counties. Actually, all these counties had really interesting information, science-based, on coffee grounds. So there's actually 3 possible ways to use coffee grounds. And the first is using them as top mulch. This actually, the literature was saying it keeps snails and slugs away. If you do it this way, you apply no more than a ½ inch cover with a thin layer, maybe up to 4 inches of coarse organic mulch, like wood chips, on the top. If coffee grounds dry out, they can actually repel water. So you don't want that to happen. So that's the first possible way, is at the top and mulch. And a little bit better way is you can cultivate them into the soil, but a little goes a long way. In fact, Oregon State University's research found that, and this is a little tricky, they found that if you add too many coffee grounds, it stimulates the growth of soil organisms that then use the nitrogen in the soil to process the coffee grounds. And so nitrogen, doing it this way, can actually deplete your soil of nitrogen. And plants can suffer, because plants absolutely need nitrogen to grow. So their Glenn County Master Gardener actually had a call-in line, and it was a Master Gardener that said, I heard coffee grounds were absolutely great. So I applied as a deterrent to gophers. He had a lot of gophers. So he applied 500 pounds of coffee grounds to a small area. Now, believe it or not, the gophers didn't come back, but he killed off all his plants. And he thought it was acid. And the Master Gardener was correct to say it was actually nitrogen depletion of the soil, and recommended using a good nitrogen, organic nitrogen fertilizer. So that's cultivating some into the soil. You could do it, but a little goes a long way. it's actually best, the literature says, it's actually best to add coffee grounds to your compost bin, but no more than taking up 20 to 25% of your compost. And that's going to smell a little bit like coffee when you add them in the beginning. It actually helps maintain a high compost temperature and attracts earthworms in your compost bins. So as a reference, this next slide is exactly the same as the slide I just presented. It just has all the information in case you wanted to look back at this presentation and see what I said. Okay, so summary, coffee grounds are okay as top mulch, a small amount, okay to cultivate into the soil, small amount, best to compost, and perfect to give as gifts. My friends really appreciate, we call them porch fairies these days, where people go put things on people's porches, and I have been known to put coffee grounds on people's porches. That was my first true confession. How we doing on time?
You're in great shape, Joan, for the moment. I have temporarily put you back up on the lead here because we have a question about the coffee grounds that I wanted to get in right here. So you'll have to share your screen again when you're ready to restart.
All righty.
And the question was, can you feed coffee grounds to worms?
Oh, very good question. Thank you. There's a little bit of a controversy about that, because some worm composters actually do use coffee grounds in a small amount and said the worms love them. And then I read also that if you add too many, you're going to kill off all your worms. So what do the rest of my master gardeners know about this?
Well, I will tell you that in my experience with the vermicompost, the worms will eat it. They do use it as a grit or a gravel because they do need some food that is not strictly mushy, so they can digest their food, because they don't have, like birds, they use grit. But I would definitely try not to put too much of anything in the worm bin. And so, if you think about it, is a cup of coffee or two a day fine? Sure. Are several pots going to be good for us? No, probably not true for worms either. But yeah, there's definitely some controversy about how much is too much and if any at all is okay. But I have used them.
Thank you. There's also an interesting, there was a talk, or one of the articles was about caffeine. Somebody had asked about caffeine, that actually caffeine does go into the soil and can affect your plants with like a super bloom and then kind of a die off. So I didn't read enough about that, but if you're interested in more on coffee grounds, do the UC-A&R coffee grounds and you'll get all sorts of good information. So my second true confession is I actually didn't realize the value of trees. Trees are involved in social justice and environmental justice too. I'm a nutritionist by trade and a vegetable gardener. And so I know about food security, food insecurity in our communities and our lower income communities. But actually, California has the lowest tree canopy per person in the United States, and poor neighborhoods have even less. And I want to read the little part at the bottom of the slide. If we show you a map of tree canopy in virtually any city in America, we're also showing you a map of income. And in many cases, we're showing you a map of race and ethnicity. That was so meaningful to me when I heard this talk as a master gardener, that I really wanted to learn more about trees and what they do for us and see what we can all do, which is basically plant more trees. And that's including fruit trees. So this has to do with landscape trees, and this has to do with fruit trees. So that was just fascinating to me. The Master Gardener program really opened my eyes. So trees actually help lower the impact of climate change by storing carbon dioxide. So these are some big landscape trees, and then this is a brand new little cherry tree over here at the corner. So we're talking about all sorts of trees. And I'll do a real quick explanation of global warming. You look at the sun. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not. Oh, Roger says yes. Joan says yes. The sun has incoming energy, both the light and the solar radiation, and it usually just bounces off of the earth. But when you see this ring here, these are little trapped energy. This is CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So when the sun's energy can't escape all the way, the atmosphere gets more greenhouse gases, which heats up the earth. So that's what we're talking about in global warming and the greenhouse effect. So what do we want to do? We want to get rid of this trapped energy. So they're trapping the heat instead of allowing it to escape. And our planet gets hotter. Not good. So what can we do? Trees to the rescue. We said that trees absorb carbon dioxide and store it. And older trees are much better at storing carbon dioxide than some of those younger trees. And it takes 8 mature trees per person to absorb all the carbon dioxide that one person emits in a lifetime. So we really need a lot of trees, lots and lots of trees. So this was really interesting to me in terms, because I really, really, really like data and I really, really like research. So this substitution study called Space for Time looked at trees in 2099. It was just done last year. So that means they're looking into the future, 80 years from now. What will the trees look like with global warming? So they actually made pairings of cities, and I'll show you the reference here in case you'd actually really like to read this study. It's very interesting. So in 2099, Fresno could be the same temperature as El Centro is today. So we're looking forward with global, not looking forward to, looking forward with global warming. And Fresno is right here with this red arrow. It's in the Central Valley over there, and El Centro is way down here. So they are both inland cities, but El Centro is hotter than Fresno. So in 2099, Fresno could be the same temperature as El Centro is today. So the scientists are looking as to whether or not the current Fresno trees, will they survive in 2099 when the temperature is hotter? So what do we think? Unfortunately, no. Only half of the current tree species growing in Fresno today would survive in 2099. Half of them won't. So we really need to be conscious of what we need to do in Fresno today. So what should Fresno do? Fresno should start planting trees now that are currently found in El Centro, so they can grow those trees and the trees can be mature as when global warming comes. I thought this was fascinating. Berkeley is paired with Santa Ana. There's a lot more. Burbank is paired with, I can't remember, you'll have to look it up. But fascinating research that I learned as a new master gardener. My confession is I didn't know much about trees and their value. I just love them. So Janet Harton was the one who actually spoke to us in the Master Gardener class. She is fantastic. And this is a spotlight webinar. That is the link. And Anastasia, if you could put that in the chat, that would be lovely, because Anastasia is such a good guru on how to do these things. That's a wonderful, wonderful webinar.
Judy, I'm going to ask you to hold on to that last confession as something that we're going to take a look at next time around. We've come right up to right near the hour, and I like to try to honor our time frame, and I appreciate you being flexible on that. It looks like something potato oriented, so I can't wait. I'm ready for some French fries myself. And it's interesting that you talked about trees there. I want to note that next workshop on July 21st, that is the first and the third Tuesday. So the third Tuesday of July is July 21st. We should have a local expert, guru, hero, to talk to us about fixing up fruit trees that you may have in your yard, summer fruit tree pruning. But also we'll be talking about some of the fruit tree varieties that you can plant that are for sale right now in the garden supply stores for not too much money. And a fruit tree, a $30 fruit tree, will produce $30 worth of fruit once it starts producing year after year after year. It's not the optimal time to be putting in a fruit tree, but it's not impossible. And so we want to, since they're out there and they're being priced well, and it's time for summer pruning, we're going to have a little bit of talk about trees next time around. We do have a couple of quick questions. One question that did come up is if you are aware of any programs for tree planting in general. If you could let us know about that, either here or on the Ask an LA County Master Gardener page. You can pass it on to Jessica and she'll make sure it's there. And then there was also a question from a ways back asking if plants needed to be surface watered when they're new and then deep watered when they're young. And you're going to hate me for this answer. The answer is yes, but that's because they need to be deep watered in general. Many plants require consistent water, whether it's consistently every other day and deeply, or every day fairly deeply. But if you're watering deeply, you're necessarily watering shallow too, because it has to go through the shallow part first. So it's much better to get the water down further where the plant can draw from it over a longer period of time, where there's less evaporation and subject to the needs of specific plants. Peppers, tomatoes really hate it when you're inconsistent. They like you to show up on time and be regular. So Master Gardeners, any other thing to add in there about the water question? Excellent. All right.
Just
Yes.
Roger, like you already mentioned, but we're watering deeply to encourage the roots to grow deeply.
Absolutely. And then that's true. If you're only ever watering shallow, those roots are never going to deep dive, and you'll always be subject to evaporation, and the plants will sneak up on you in running out of water. Awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's been an hour. It's just coming up on 11 o'clock, and I really appreciate you joining us. Same time in 2 weeks on July 21st on the third Tuesday. Same link. And we intend to continue for a while yet until the emergency orders are lifted. We will be having some additional workshops, some one-offs that are very focused on specific topics, including some of the Garden in Place crew and some other folks. In the fall, the UCANR folks here, the Cooperative Extension, will be offering Grow LA Victory Garden classes, which is a series of 4 weekend classes and a Google Classroom set of materials and a certification as a LA Victory Gardener, if you're interested in that. If you are a little more advanced than that and you're really interested in the late fall, November, December, you have to be thinking about this, they take applications for Master Gardener classes. If you're into this gardening thing and you've decided you really want to get the cool name badge and be able to talk like you know what you're talking about while you're massively looking it up online and nobody's looking, if you would like to have that opportunity, keep your ears open on the various Facebook pages. The applications don't even get accepted until December, and the course starts next spring. And this time I think it'll be partly online. All right. Last call for any interesting ideas. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.